At my grandson Ethan's 16th birthday, I handed him the keys to a restored car, thinking it would bring joy, but the moment Melissa, my daughter-in-law, saw it, her smile vanished and she leaned in and said coldly, "If you can afford a car like that, then you can afford to sign the house over to us too." The room went silent, Jason avoided my eyes, and Ethan froze with the keys still in his hand. I gave a soft laugh, like I didn't hear her properly, but inside something shifted. Melissa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't need a house that big anymore. It's time to think about the future, our future." I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he stayed quiet. That silence hurt more than her words. I placed my hand on the table, slowly standing up, and said nothing, because what I was about to discover about that house wasn't something they were ready for. If I had known that a simple birthday gift for my grandson would turn into a demand for my entire home, I would have never walked into that room with a smile on my face. It started on a warm Saturday afternoon in Ohio, the kind of day where the sunlight feels gentle and the air carries the faint sound of kids playing somewhere down the street. I, Evelyn Carter, 72 years old, had spent weeks preparing for this moment. My grandson Ethan was turning 16, and I wanted it to be special. Not extravagant, not flashy, just meaningful. So when I finally let him outside and showed him the car I had spent months restoring, a modest but reliable used sedan, carefully cleaned, polished, and repaired, I thought I was giving him more than just transportation. I thought I was giving him independence, pride, and a memory he could carry into adulthood. His eyes lit up the moment he saw it, and for a brief second, I felt that rare warmth only family moments can bring. Jason, my son, stood beside me nodding with approval, even smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a while, and Ethan kept saying thank you over and over again, almost unable to believe it. But then everything shifted the moment my daughter-in-law, Melissa, stepped closer. She didn't smile. She didn't congratulate. She just stared at the car like it was a calculation she was already doing in her head. I noticed the change in her expression before she even spoke, that subtle tightening around her eyes, the way her arms folded as if she was preparing for a negotiation rather than a family celebration. And then she said it, calm and precise, like she had been waiting for the right moment. "If you can afford to give a car like that, then you can afford to sign the house over to us too." For a moment, I actually thought I misheard her. The backyard, the laughter, even Ethan's smile seemed to fade into a strange silence, as if the world itself had paused to make sure I understood what she just said. Jason stopped smiling. Ethan's grip on the car keys tightened. I looked at Melissa, searching her face for some sign of humor, some hint that this was a joke that had gone too far, but there was nothing playful in her expression. Only certainty. Only expectation. I gave a small, controlled laugh, the kind people use when they don't want to create tension, and said softly, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation." But Melissa didn't move. She stepped closer instead, lowering her voice just enough so it felt personal, intentional. "You don't need a house that big anymore, Evelyn. It's just sitting there. We're thinking about the future, about stability for Ethan." That was the first time she used my grandson as part of the argument, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. Jason still said nothing. That silence hurt more than her words. I turned my head slightly toward him, waiting for him to step in, to say something reasonable, something grounding, but he avoided my gaze entirely, suddenly fascinated by the ground beneath his shoes. The same boy I raised, the same man I supported through every difficult season of his life, now standing silent while his wife made claims about my home. I slowly placed the car keys I had been holding onto the hood of the vehicle, as if grounding myself in something physical could steady what was happening inside me. The air felt different now, heavier, like the moment after a storm warning when you realize the storm has already begun. Ethan finally spoke, quietly, confused. "Mom, what are you talking about?" But Melissa didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on me. "I'm talking about planning ahead," she said, "about not holding on to things you don't really need anymore." The words were polite on the surface, but underneath them was something sharp, something transactional. I had seen people like this before in business meetings years ago when I still worked part-time as a bookkeeper, people who dressed demands in reasonable language until they sounded like suggestions. But this wasn't a meeting. This was my family. I looked at Jason again, slower this time, giving him a chance to step into the conversation, to remind everyone in that moment that boundaries still existed. Instead, he finally spoke, but not to defend me. "Mom," he said quietly, "maybe we should talk about this later." Later. As if what she just said was something casual, something that could be postponed like a grocery list. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not acceptance, not agreement, but clarity. I had given this family more than they would ever acknowledge out loud. Years of help with bills when Jason first started his business. Months of caring for Ethan when he was younger so they could focus on work. Countless holidays hosted in my home, every table set, every meal prepared with care. And now, standing in my own yard, I was being spoken to as if I was a financial resource instead of a mother, a grandmother, a person. Melissa tilted her head slightly, watching me like she expected a reaction, like she was measuring how much pressure it would take before I gave in. "It would make things easier for everyone," she added, almost gently now. That word, easier, hung in the air longer than anything else. I looked at the house in the distance behind them. My house. The place I had lived in for over 30 years. The place where Jason took his first steps, where my husband and I built every memory we had before he passed. I could hear Ethan still standing behind them, confused, shifting uncomfortably, still holding the keys to the car I had given him just minutes earlier. I turned back to Melissa and, for the first time, I really looked at her not as family, not as my son's wife, but as someone revealing her intentions too early, too confidently. And I said nothing. Not because I didn't have words, but because something in me had already begun to change. Something quiet, something steady, something that understood that this moment was not the end of a conversation, but the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. After those words were left hanging in the air like something unfinished and dangerous, I noticed the shift in energy immediately, as if the entire afternoon had quietly tilted onto a different axis that no one else wanted to acknowledge. Melissa was still standing there in the same spot, her posture unchanged, but now there was a subtle satisfaction in the way she held her chin slightly higher. Like she believed she had already introduced an idea that would eventually become reality if spoken often enough. Jason finally moved, but only to place his hand on Ethan's shoulder, not in comfort, but in a way that looked more like containment, as if he was trying to keep the situation from spilling further out of control without actually confronting it. Ethan, still holding the car keys I had given him, looked between all of us with growing confusion, his voice soft when he finally asked again what was really going on, but no one gave him a clear answer, because the adults in the room had already stopped speaking the same emotional language. I walked slowly toward the back porch steps, not because I was leaving, but because I needed space between myself and the words that had just been spoken, and as I sat down, I could still hear Melissa behind me talking to Jason in a low, controlled voice about responsibilities, future planning, and not letting assets sit unused, words that sounded polished but felt strangely rehearsed, like they had been practiced before they were ever spoken out loud. I remember looking out across my backyard, noticing how ordinary everything still looked, the garden chairs still neatly arranged from earlier, the faint sound of wind moving through the trees, and I asked myself when exactly my home had stopped being seen as a place and started being treated like a resource. Jason eventually followed me outside, closing the door gently behind him, and for a brief moment I thought he might finally say what I needed to hear, but instead he sighed and said, "Mom, she is just thinking about long-term stability." As if that explanation could somehow soften what had just happened. I turned to look at him then, really looked at him, and I realized how carefully he was choosing every word, how deeply he was trying to avoid any position that required him to take responsibility for either side. I asked him quietly when we had started talking about my house like it was a shared discussion, and he hesitated before answering, which told me everything I needed to know without him having to say much more. He told me Melissa had been bringing it up recently, that she had been worried about maintenance, taxes, and what would happen eventually, but every phrase he used felt like it had been filtered through her voice first, reshaped into something that sounded reasonable enough not to question. I remember feeling a strange stillness in my chest, not panic, not anger, but a kind of emotional distance forming, like I was stepping slightly outside of the situation in order to observe it more clearly. From where I was sitting, I could see Ethan still standing near the car, turning the keys over in his hands, clearly trying to process the excitement of his gift alongside the tension that had suddenly consumed the entire day. Melissa eventually stepped inside the house without saying much more, as if she had already made her point and no longer needed to participate in the aftermath, and Jason followed her shortly after, leaving me outside with nothing but the sound of the wind and my own thoughts. I sat there longer than I intended, replaying every word that had been spoken, especially the way she had connected a simple gift to a much larger expectation. As if generosity was not an act of love, but a signal of capacity that could be reassigned. I thought about how often I had opened my home without hesitation, how many times I had said, of course, when they needed help, never imagining that one day those moments would be reinterpreted as justification rather than kindness. When I finally stood up, I walked slowly toward the kitchen window and looked inside, watching them move around as if nothing irreversible had been said. And that was when I noticed Melissa checking her phone with a calm expression that did not match the tension she had created earlier, and Jason standing near her as if awaiting direction rather than contributing to a conversation. Something about that image stayed with me longer than anything else that day, because it no longer looked like a family disagreement, it looked like alignment, like decisions had already been made somewhere I had not been included in. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table alone, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and I began to understand that what had been said outside was not a spontaneous remark, but a request that had been prepared in advance and delivered only when the opportunity felt right. And for the first time since that afternoon began, I stopped trying to explain it away. Later that evening, the house felt different in a way I could not easily explain, not because anything had physically changed, but because something unspoken had settled into every corner like dust you only notice when the light hits it a certain way. I stayed at the kitchen table long after Jason and Melissa had stopped talking to me, listening to the quiet sounds of movement upstairs. Footsteps that no longer felt like they belonged to a shared rhythm, but instead to separate intentions operating under the same roof. At one point, I heard Melissa laughing softly at something on her phone, and that sound alone carried more weight than anything she had said earlier, because it reminded me how quickly tension can be compartmentalized when someone believes they are in control of the outcome. Jason came downstairs briefly to get a glass of water, and when he saw me still sitting there, he paused for a moment as if unsure whether he should speak or simply continue avoiding the conversation entirely, and eventually he chose the latter, offering only a small nod before returning upstairs without sitting down. I remember watching him leave and thinking how strange it was that my own son could move through my home like a guest trying not to disturb the arrangement of furniture. Ethan eventually came inside as well, still holding the keys to the car, and he placed them carefully on the counter beside me without saying much, except to ask quietly if everything was okay. A question far too large for a 16-year-old to be carrying in a moment like that. I told him I was fine, because that is what people say when they are not ready to explain things that have not yet fully formed into words, and he nodded even though I could tell he did not believe me. After he went upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen again, staring at the reflection of the ceiling light in the polished surface of the table, and I began to think about the way Melissa had spoken earlier, not just the words themselves, but the confidence behind them, as if she had already accounted for my reaction and decided it would not matter in the long run. That realization lingered longer than anything else, because it suggested preparation, and preparation suggests intention, and intention suggests that what happened in the backyard was not the beginning of something, but the continuation of something I had not been invited to see. I stood up slowly and walked through the hallway toward the living room, noticing small details I had overlooked for months, like the way certain conversations stopped when I entered a room, or the way Jason had begun referring to we instead of I when discussing decisions about his household. The living room felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes ordinary objects feel slightly unfamiliar, and I found myself looking at photographs on the wall, images of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary family moments that now felt like they belonged to a different version of this family dynamic. I paused in front of one photograph in particular, taken during a summer barbecue 2 years earlier, where everyone looked relaxed and unburdened, and I realized how easily time can disguise shifts in loyalty when they happen slowly enough to feel natural. Melissa came downstairs. Sometime later, her presence announced not by sound, but by the subtle change in atmosphere that always seemed to follow her, and she stopped when she saw me standing in the living room, holding her phone loosely in one hand. For a moment neither of us spoke, and I noticed how composed she remained, as if the earlier conversation had already been archived in her mind as a resolved matter. She asked me if I was feeling tired, in a tone that sounded almost considerate, but carried no real curiosity, and I told her I was simply thinking. She nodded as if that answer was sufficient, then added casually that she and Jason had been discussing practical arrangements, a phrase she used so easily it sounded like it had been repeated many times before in other conversations I was not part of. I asked her what exactly she meant by practical arrangements, and there was a brief pause, just long enough to reveal that my question had not been unexpected, but it also had not been fully accounted for in her preferred sequence of events. She explained that houses often became burdens for older homeowners, that maintenance costs increased, that responsibilities should be transitioned earlier rather than later. And she spoke with the kind of calm confidence that comes from rehearsed reasoning rather than spontaneous concern. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand how far this thinking had already progressed without my awareness. Jason appeared at the top of the stairs during this exchange, hearing part of the conversation, and instead of joining it, he lingered there briefly before stepping back, as if deciding it was safer not to be seen choosing a position too clearly. Melissa continued speaking, gently reinforcing the idea that keeping the house within the immediate family unit under structured planning would be beneficial, and I noticed how carefully she avoided using any language that sounded like demand, even though the meaning of her words was unmistakably directional. When she finally finished, she looked at me as if waiting for agreement, or at least acknowledgement, and I gave neither. Instead, I simply said I understood what she was suggesting, which was technically true, because I did understand it now in a way I had not understood it before. After she left the room, I stood alone again in the living space that had suddenly become quieter than usual, and I realized that what I had been hearing all day was not just a disagreement about a house or a car, but the early shape of a shift in control that had been unfolding gradually long before that afternoon ever began. And in that silence, I started to recognize that the most important decisions were no longer being discussed with me, but around me. That night stayed with me in a way that sleep could not soften, because even when the house grew completely quiet and the lights were turned off one by one, my mind continued to replay every detail with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as if my memory itself was refusing to let anything blur or fade. I lay in bed for a long time without moving, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling, the occasional creak of wood, the distant hum of a refrigerator, and I found myself thinking not about what had been said earlier, but about what had been left unsaid, because silence often carries more intention than words ever do. At some point in the early morning, I got up and walked through the hallway without turning on the lights, moving slowly past framed photographs and closed doors that now felt like boundaries rather than parts of a shared home. And I noticed how different everything looked when I was no longer viewing it as permanent. In the kitchen, I made a cup of tea out of habit more than need, and as I stood there waiting for the water to warm, I thought back over the years, not in broad memories, but in specific moments that suddenly felt connected in a way I had never noticed before. I remembered the first time Jason and Melissa asked to stay longer than planned after a holiday visit, and how it had seemed harmless at the time, just a practical request, nothing worth questioning. I remembered when discussions about finances slowly shifted from advice I was asked for into updates I was simply informed about afterward. I remembered the first time Melissa suggested that I did not need to manage certain bills myself anymore, offering to help organize things, and how I had felt relieved rather than suspicious, because trust often disguises itself as convenience until you look back and see the pattern forming. Standing in the quiet kitchen, I began to understand that what I was experiencing now did not begin in the backyard that afternoon, but had been developing in small increments over a long period of time, each moment too small to challenge on its own, yet together forming something far more structured than I had ever allowed myself to see. I sat down at the table again, holding the warm cup in my hands, and I thought about Melissa's words, especially the way she spoke about responsibility and transition, as if they were natural progressions rather than decisions with emotional weight attached. There was a particular confidence in her tone that kept returning to me, not aggressive, not loud, but steady, as if repetition alone could eventually turn suggestion into expectation. Jason's silence also returned to my thoughts, not as a single absence of response, but as a pattern of avoidance that had been building quietly over time, each moment of deflection reinforcing the last until it became easier not to engage at all. I realized that I had been interpreting his silence as neutrality, when in reality it may have been something far more complicated, something shaped by influence, convenience, or even fatigue from avoiding conflict. When I finally went back upstairs, I stopped briefly outside the door to their room, hearing the faint sound of conversation inside, too soft to distinguish words, but enough to confirm that discussions continued even when I was not present. I did not knock. Instead, I returned to my own room and sat by the window for a long time, looking out at the dark outline of the neighborhood where every house appeared still and ordinary, yet I knew that within each one, decisions and tensions could exist quietly beneath the surface of daily routine. I began to think about my house differently now, not just as a place where I lived, but as an asset that had already entered other conversations. Without my full awareness, and that realization carried a weight that was not emotional in the traditional sense, but structural, like noticing a foundation shift after the building has already begun to move. I thought about how easily trust can become assumption, and how assumption can become permission when left unchallenged long enough. By the time the sky began to lighten slightly, I had not reached any conclusion, but I had reached something more important, a clear awareness that the situation was no longer static. It was moving, even if only in conversations I was not included in, and that meant I could no longer afford to interpret silence as safety. And as I sat there watching the first hint of morning appear, I understood that whatever was happening inside my family was no longer something unfolding around me, but something steadily moving toward a point where I would eventually have to respond. I did not realize how quickly silence could turn into evidence until that morning, when I came downstairs earlier than usual and found Jason sitting alone at the kitchen table with his phone in one hand and a printed document in the other. His expression focused in a way that immediately made me stop before entering fully into the room. He did not notice me at first, and I stood quietly in the hallway watching him scan through the pages, occasionally pausing as if comparing information, as if something on that paper required careful confirmation rather than casual reading. When he finally looked up and saw me, there was a brief moment where neither of us spoke, and I could tell he was deciding how to respond to my presence rather than reacting naturally to it. He folded the document slightly, not enough to hide it completely, but enough to signal hesitation, and I asked him what he was reading. His answer came after a pause that felt longer than it should have been, something about financial organization and estate structure, words that sounded formal enough to feel distant, yet familiar enough to make me uneasy. I asked him where the document came from, and he said it was something Melissa had been reviewing to understand long-term planning better, and the way he said it made it sound like a routine household discussion rather than something involving ownership and property. Melissa entered the kitchen moments later, perfectly composed, holding a cup of coffee as if the conversation had already been scheduled. She greeted me politely, but there was a subtle confidence in her tone that suggested continuity, as if the conversation Jason and I were having was already part of a larger thread she had been managing all along. She asked if I had slept well, and before I could answer, she added that she had been thinking about practical solutions regarding household management, again using that careful language that softened meaning without changing intent. I noticed Jason did not contradict her, only shifted slightly in his seat, and that small movement told me more than anything either of them said. I sat down across from them, and for a moment I simply observed, not participating, just listening to the rhythm of how they spoke when they were aligned. Melissa explained that she had been reviewing general planning options for families in situations like ours, emphasizing efficiency, sustainability, and shared responsibility. And I realized that every phrase she used was designed to sound reasonable when heard in isolation. I asked her directly what she meant by situations like ours, and she smiled slightly before answering that it was natural for older homeowners to gradually transition control of property to the next generation when stability was needed. The word transition appeared again, the same word I had heard the night before, and hearing it repeated in different contexts made it feel less like a suggestion and more like a framework that had already been decided upon elsewhere. Jason finally spoke, saying he did not want me to feel pressured, but his voice lacked conviction, and I could hear the tension between what he was saying and what he was allowing to happen. Melissa placed her coffee down carefully and began explaining how families often avoided conflict by making early adjustments, and I realized she was not speaking about possibility, but about expectation. After breakfast, I went into the living room and sat down, trying to separate emotion from observation, because something in me understood that reacting too quickly would only blur what was actually happening. I began noticing small inconsistencies in how my belongings were being referenced, not directly challenged, but subtly reframed in conversation, as if ownership was gradually becoming shared language rather than individual certainty. That afternoon, I overheard Melissa on the phone speaking in a calm, structured tone about review timelines and documentation readiness, and although I could not hear every detail, the cadence of her speech suggested preparation rather than discussion. Later that day, I found Jason reviewing bank statements at the dining table again, and when I asked him if something was wrong, he said he was just making sure everything was organized properly. But he avoided explaining why organization required so much attention to my accounts. I did not confront him further in that moment, because I was beginning to understand that direct questions were no longer producing direct answers. Instead, I started observing patterns, and those patterns were becoming harder to ignore. Over the next several days, I noticed that conversations about the house always circled back to structure, responsibility, or future planning, never to my preferences or comfort. Melissa began referencing external examples of families who had successfully transitioned property early, as if she were building a case rather than discussing a household matter. Jason gradually stopped initiating conversations with me about finances altogether and instead deferred to Melissa whenever the topic arose, which created a quiet imbalance that I could feel but not immediately interrupt. One evening, I found a folder left open on the kitchen counter containing printed pages that reference property management terms, legal structures, and asset allocation language that I had never seen used in our home before. I did not read everything immediately, but I recognized enough to understand that this was not casual reading material, and that it had likely been discussed in contexts I was not present for. When Jason walked in and saw me holding the folder, he looked uncomfortable, but did not ask me to put it down, instead saying it was just informational, a phrase that seemed designed to reduce significance without denying content. Melissa joined us shortly after, and when she saw the folder in my hands, she did not react with surprise or concern, only a composed acknowledgement, as if the moment had been anticipated. She explained that understanding options early helped avoid confusion later, and again used the word transition as if it were an established process rather than a proposed idea. I asked her when exactly these discussions had started, and she replied that it was simply responsible planning for families with shared interests. That phrase stayed with me longer than anything else, because it reframed everything not as personal negotiation, but as collective assumption. That night, I sat alone in my room again, and for the first time I stopped trying to interpret their behavior as separate incidents. Instead, I began to see continuity, and in that continuity I recognized intention forming slowly beneath politeness. It was no longer about a single request or a single conversation. It was about direction. And once I understood that, I also understood that what I had been calling confusion was actually structure taking shape without my participation. The shift became impossible to ignore once I stopped treating each conversation as isolated moments and began listening to the pattern underneath them. Because what had once felt like casual discussions about organization and planning was now forming into something structured, deliberate, and increasingly confident in its direction. That morning, I woke earlier than usual again, not because I had slept poorly, but because my mind had begun to wake before my body did, as if it was trying to stay ahead of something I had not yet fully named. In the kitchen, I heard movement before I saw anyone, and when I stepped inside, I found Melissa already there, standing near the counter as if she had been awake long enough to make the space feel temporarily hers. Jason was seated at the table again, this time with a laptop open in front of him, and the sight of both of them together in that space created a feeling of quiet exclusion that I could not dismiss as coincidence anymore. Melissa greeted me with the same composed warmth she always used, but now I could recognize the consistency of it, how it never shifted regardless of context, as if emotional variation had been intentionally removed from her interactions. Jason closed the laptop slightly when I entered, but not fully, and I noticed that hesitation again, the same pattern of partial concealment that suggested I was no longer the intended audience for what was being reviewed. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down without speaking at first, allowing the silence to exist without rushing to fill it, because I had begun to understand that silence itself was becoming a kind of language in this household. Melissa eventually spoke, explaining that she had been looking into practical frameworks for long-term family coordination, and I noticed how effortlessly she inserted that phrase into conversation, as if it belonged naturally in a kitchen setting. Jason added that it was just general planning, nothing urgent, but his tone lacked the ease of someone describing something truly casual. I asked what specifically they were planning, and there was a brief pause, not dramatic, but precise, as if my question required them to adjust their language before responding. Melissa explained that it was about ensuring stability, reducing future complications, and aligning responsibilities more clearly, and each phrase sounded neutral enough on its own. But together they formed a direction that could not be mistaken for randomness. I asked if this had anything to do with the house, and Jason looked down before answering, confirming that it was part of broader planning discussions, but still avoiding direct acknowledgement of ownership or decision. That avoidance was becoming familiar now, not as confusion, but as strategy, and I could feel the difference even if no one else was willing to name it. After breakfast, I went upstairs and began going through old documents of my own, not because I suspected anything specific yet, but because I needed to ground myself in what I knew rather than what was being suggested to me. As I reviewed paperwork related to the house, I noticed how often Melissa's influence appeared indirectly in recent conversations, always framed as assistance, never as authority, yet increasingly present in timing and emphasis. Later that day, I overheard Jason and Melissa speaking in the living room while I was in the hallway, and although I could not hear every word clearly, I recognized recurring phrases like timeline adjustment, ownership clarity, and family alignment, repeated with the same calm precision that suggested preparation rather than discussion. I stayed still, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I wanted to understand whether they were aware of how structured their language had become when they thought I was not fully listening. That evening, Melissa brought up the idea of reviewing long-term living arrangements again, this time more directly, and she explained it as something many families did proactively to avoid uncertainty later in life. Jason nodded as she spoke, and I noticed how easily he accepted the framing of her language without challenging its assumptions, as if agreement had become the default position rather than a choice. I asked him if he personally believed there was a problem that needed solving, and his answer was carefully neutral, stating only that it was about being prepared, not about urgency or pressure. But even that distinction felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Melissa then mentioned that she had been organizing supporting information to help guide future decisions, and she used the word guide in a way that subtly shifted responsibility away from discussion and toward direction. At that moment, I realized that the conversations I had been hearing were not isolated planning discussions, but part of a continuous process that was gradually narrowing possibilities without ever stating that narrowing explicitly. I stood up from the table and walked toward the window, looking out at the yard that had once represented stability to me, and I tried to separate what I was feeling from what I was observing. The facts remained simple, but their arrangement was becoming harder to ignore. Repeated discussions about structure, increasing reference to timing, and a consistent avoidance of my direct input in decisions that involved my own property. When I turned back, both Jason and Melissa were watching me quietly, not with aggression, but with expectation, as if waiting to see whether I would accept the framework being constructed around me or resist it. I did not answer immediately, because I understood that whatever came next would no longer be about clarification. It would be about position. I realized something had changed not because anyone announced it, but because the way I was being treated inside my own home no longer felt like participation in a family, but like observation of a process already in motion. That morning began like the others, with Jason and Melissa in the kitchen before I came down, but there was a subtle difference I could feel immediately, a kind of quiet coordination between them that did not require speaking to be understood. Jason was no longer just avoiding conflict. He was now actively following a structure I had not been shown, and Melissa moved through the space with the calm assurance of someone who believed the conversation had already advanced beyond my level of input. When I entered, they both acknowledged me at the same time, but in different ways that revealed alignment rather than spontaneity. Melissa smiled briefly and asked if I had slept well, while Jason simply gestured toward the table where a stack of printed pages had been placed neatly, as if they had been waiting for my arrival. I sat down slowly and asked what those documents were, and Jason explained that they were part of finalized planning references, using a tone that suggested the process had already crossed several invisible thresholds before reaching me. Melissa added that she had organized them to make things simpler for everyone involved, and the phrase sounded less like assistance and more like conclusion preparation. I picked up the pages and immediately recognized terms related to property structure, transfer options, and long-term allocation language that felt out of place in a family kitchen, yet presented here as if they were routine. I asked Jason when exactly these discussions had become formal enough to require documents, and he hesitated before answering that it was something Melissa had been helping structure gradually, which confirmed that progression had been occurring without my direct awareness. Melissa did not interrupt him, but I noticed the small expression of approval she gave, as if the wording he chose aligned correctly with her intention. I set the papers back down and asked directly whether any decisions had already been made, and the silence that followed felt more informative than any answer could have been. Jason finally said that nothing was finalized yet, but the way he avoided eye contact suggested that finalized and decided were being treated as separate concepts within their framework. Melissa then explained that it was about ensuring continuity of family assets, and she used that phrase carefully, as if it was designed to sound responsible rather than intrusive. I asked her why I was only now seeing these discussions in document form, and she responded that these things were easier to understand when organized clearly rather than discussed emotionally. A statement that reframed my reaction as emotional instability rather than informational exclusion. Jason looked uncomfortable but did not correct her. Instead, he added that they were trying to avoid confusion later, which again placed the focus on my supposed inability to process rather than their decision to proceed without involving me earlier. I remember sitting there, looking at both of them and realizing that the conversation was no longer about whether something should happen, but about how to present something that was already assumed to be inevitable. Later that day, I walked through the house more carefully than I had in years, not because I had not seen it before, but because I was now seeing how often it had been discussed without me in rooms I thought I still fully belonged to. In the living room, I noticed additional folders placed on the side table, and when I asked Jason about them later, he said they were supporting outlines Melissa had prepared for clarity. The phrasing again suggested that clarity was being created for me rather than with me, and that distinction felt increasingly important. That evening, Melissa spoke about reducing future uncertainty during dinner, and she mentioned timelines again, this time referencing transition readiness as if it was a natural stage of household development. Jason nodded occasionally, but contributed very little beyond agreement, and I noticed that, even when he looked at me, it was with a kind of cautious neutrality, as if he was trying not to disrupt a balance that had already been negotiated elsewhere. I asked him quietly if he felt comfortable with how quickly everything was moving, and he paused before saying that it was not about comfort, but about practicality, which was a response that avoided emotional position entirely. Melissa then added that families often found peace when decisions were made before stress entered the picture, and I realized she was describing my absence from decision-making as a preventative measure rather than a removal. After dinner, I returned to my room and sat by the window again, but this time I was not trying to interpret behavior as isolated events. I was tracking consistency. Every phrase, every document, every reference to timing or structure was pointing in the same direction, and that direction did not require my agreement to continue forming. I began to understand that what I had been calling discussion was actually coordination, and what I had been calling planning was actually implementation in slow motion. And for the first time, I stopped asking when they would include me, because I could already see that the system they were building did not require inclusion in the way I had assumed it would. I began to notice that the atmosphere inside the house was no longer simply tense, but organized in a way that suggested an invisible structure was already guiding how every interaction should unfold. And that realization became impossible to ignore as the days continued. Each morning started the same way now, with Jason and Melissa already awake, already talking, already positioned in a space that felt increasingly coordinated rather than spontaneous, and I would enter the kitchen feeling less like a participant in family life and more like someone arriving after decisions had already been made. That morning, I found Melissa standing by the counter reviewing another set of printed pages, while Jason sat with his phone open, scrolling through something that he quickly locked when I approached. The brief hesitation in his movement told me more than any explanation could have, because it confirmed that what I was not seeing had become just as important as what I was being shown. Melissa greeted me politely and immediately began speaking about alignment steps, a phrase she used so naturally now that it no longer sounded like planning, but like procedure. Jason added that there were a few remaining clarification points they were working through, and I asked him what exactly needed clarification if nothing had been decided, but his response was careful and indirect, stating only that it was about making sure everything was clean and understandable for everyone involved. I asked who everyone referred to, and there was a pause before Melissa answered that it meant the family unit as a whole, a phrase that sounded inclusive but functioned in practice as a way to dissolve individual ownership into collective language. I sat down at the table and watched them carefully, noticing how they now reference decisions without attributing origin, as if ideas simply existed rather than being proposed by specific people. Later that morning, I found additional documents placed in a folder near the entrance of the living room, and when I asked Jason about them, he explained that they were final organization summaries, again using language that suggested conclusion rather than discussion. I began to understand that the way information was being presented was shifting from exploratory to declarative, even though no one had formally acknowledged any final decisions. Melissa joined the conversation shortly after and explained that they were trying to minimize emotional disruption by structuring transitions early, and I noticed how the word transition had now become a constant anchor in their vocabulary, repeated so often that it had begun to replace more direct language. I asked her when exactly these transitions had been agreed upon, and she responded that agreement was not a single moment but a process, which effectively removed the possibility of identifying when consent or disagreement actually mattered. Jason remained quiet during this exchange, but his posture had changed, slightly leaning toward Melissa whenever she spoke, as if unconsciously reinforcing alignment through presence alone. After they left the kitchen, I stayed behind and looked at the documents again, this time noticing how frequently my own name appeared not as a decision maker, but as a subject of planning. That realization carried a different weight than anything before it, because it was no longer about interpretation, but about placement within a structure I had not authored. That afternoon, I overheard Melissa speaking on the phone in the hallway, her tone calm and precise, using phrases like timeline readiness and asset clarity confirmation, and although I could not hear the full context, the consistency of her language suggested ongoing coordination rather than casual conversation. Jason passed by shortly after and paused when he saw me standing near the doorway, but instead of stopping, he simply nodded and continued walking, as if proximity no longer required engagement. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected because it reflected a shift not in conflict, but in participation, where presence no longer guaranteed inclusion in decision-making. Later that evening, during dinner, Melissa spoke about final review stages, and Jason confirmed that they were almost complete with organizational alignment, a phrase that sounded final even though nothing had been openly concluded. I asked him directly whether there was anything I should be doing in relation to these discussions, and he hesitated before saying that everything was being handled carefully and that I should not worry about the details. That answer, while intended to reassure, confirmed that I was no longer within the loop of responsibility, only the recipient of outcomes. After dinner, I walked slowly through the house again, noticing how many conversations now occurred in closed spaces or low voices, and how often my presence altered or paused those exchanges. I began to recognize that the structure being built was not overtly excluding me in a confrontational way, but instead gradually reducing the necessity of my input until it became optional. And in that realization, I understood that the most significant change was not what they were saying, but the fact that the system they were building no longer required my agreement to function.